Hi everyone, I'm Effany Gale. Today I'm going to be talking about working with short fiction editors and specifically about rewrites and requested edits. Let's talk about rewrites first, because those will happen earlier in the timeline if an editor does ask you for them. I don't find that happens particularly often. It's more of an occasional thing that you'll get a rewrite request from an editor. These are also called revise and resubmit sometimes, or R&Rs, but basically what they mean is that an editor isn't willing to publish your story in its current form, and they're hoping that you might be willing to make some of their suggested changes. So this happens before an acceptance, before you sign a contract with that editor, before there's any kind of commitment by that editor to purchase your piece. And the editor is hoping that if they give you 2 or 3 or more things that they want to change about your story, that you'll be willing to work with them and make those changes. And then the editor will look at your piece again once you've made those changes and then decide whether they are willing to publish it in that revised form. By asking you for these rewrites, they don't have any commitment to publish it once you've made those changes. It's basically an offer from them to say, I will look at this again if you make the edits that I'm asking you to make. The actual edits that they're looking for, they might just communicate that to you via email. So it might be a couple of sentences or more in that email saying, would you be interested in changing X and Y? And then I would look at it again. Or they might be actual sort of marked up changes in the document itself that you've submitted. I find that happens less often, but sometimes the editor wants to sort of highlight particular sentences or particular paragraphs or other things in the story, and it's clearer for them to mark it up in that document so that there's no confusion about what changes they want. Once you've received the rewrite request, it's completely up to you whether you want to take action on it or not. So you can basically accept their offer and make the changes and resend that revised story once you've made those edits. Or you can ignore their request. Maybe you think that what they've asked for is going to make the story worse, or you're just not willing to make those edits. Or alternately, you could suggest something a little bit different from what the editor has suggested, but that might still work for both of you. And then it's up to them to come back and say, sure, give that a go and we'll look at it afterwards. Or maybe they're not interested in what you've suggested and then your story wouldn't move forward with that publication anymore. I will say that I don't find it appropriate for a publication or an editor to request more than 2 rewrites without actually purchasing the story, because you're doing all of this work as a writer to make your piece more in line with that editor or that publication's tastes without having any commitment from them to publish it. So you're doing all of this work without having any assurance that your piece is actually going to be bought by that market. I have been asked for a significantly higher amount of rewrites by a publication in the past, and I went through that process of continuously rewriting the piece for them again and again because I really wanted to be published by that market. But I wouldn't do that again. Basically, if a publication asked me for more than 2 rewrites, I would say, we can continue to edit, but do you actually want to purchase this piece? I would want you to agree to publish it and to send me a contract that I could sign before I continued to edit this further for you. I also find that the more rewrites that you do for a publication, the more diminishing returns that you will get on those rewrites, because you're changing smaller and smaller things every time, presumably. And by the time that you get to, say, the 3rd or 4th rewrite, you really should just be changing things at the sentence level. And I feel like that's much more appropriate to work with an editor on in this next phase that I'll talk to you about shortly, which is the edits after the agreement to publish the piece. Some rewrites that I have been asked to do before is to cut 50% of a piece, essentially, which I didn't do. Even though it was a very nice market asking me to do that, I felt like that would completely change the story that I was trying to tell, and I wasn't willing to. So I basically ignored their kind request to edit my story like that. I've also had rewrite requests from other publications to do things like add more detail to a particular paragraph or a particular element, to change the circumstances around an event, to change some phrasing, all of which I was happy to do, and then they went on to publish my pieces. And I should say that I've never had a rewrite request where a publication has not agreed to publish my piece after I've made those changes, which is honestly very lucky. It is quite common that publications will ask for rewrite requests, but then they read what you've done and it just doesn't quite work for them enough to want to purchase it, which is completely their prerogative. And when you do take on a rewrite request and you make those changes, you have to do so knowing that even though you're making those changes, the publication has no obligation to pick up your piece once you have made those edits. So you have to go into it with that in mind. So that was all about rewrites or revise and resubmits, which happens before a contract is signed with a publication or before they agree to publish your work. And the next thing that I'm going to be talking about are edits that happen after the contract is signed or after that agreement has been come to between the publication and the writer that yes, they are going to publish this piece. And I'm going to split up this discussion about the edits into content edits and copy edits, which may or may not happen at the same time. Sometimes they happen all at once, or sometimes the content edits will come before the copy edits, which might happen closer to the time of the actual publication. Content edits might be small changes, but they will still significantly change the content of your story. So this might be adding some more detail or description around something, or removing a piece of world building that the editor doesn't think is working, or adding some more words around a character's thoughts or feelings. And the content edits, like rewrite requests, can either be given to you in the form of an email or made as track changes or comments in the actual document itself. Usually a good editor will tell you what change they want to achieve, so what the goal is, but they won't tell you how to make that change or how to get there. So it's up to you about how you want to achieve that goal, how you actually want to implement that change. And in that way, you can still hopefully feel like the story is still your own. You've still got that control about how that edit is implemented into your piece. It's just that you know what the editor is trying to achieve with that change in mind. Like with rewrite requests, you can either accept, reject, or suggest alternatives to the edits that the editor is requesting. And you don't have to do one thing for all of their changes. So for instance, if they have asked for 5 changes, you might accept 4 of them and suggest something else or decline that 5th change. The goal should be that you and the editor both want your story to be the best that it can be. And a lot of editors have really improved my stories. Their suggestions have been great, their edits have been useful. I've made those edits and I feel like the story is stronger because of them. But occasionally I have pushed back if I think that the editor hasn't entirely understood my intent with something, or occasionally if I think that their edit is actually going to be detrimental to my story. So in those cases, I've either declined the edit or I have said, what if I do this instead? Will that still get us towards where you're trying to go without necessarily specifically doing the thing that you've requested? The other time that I have pushed back on a change is if I know that what they're asking me to do is going to be really complicated or time consuming, and that they're planning to publish this in the next month, for instance, and I feel like there probably just isn't enough time for me to turn around the more complicated change that they've requested. But that's only happened to me once. You can absolutely disagree with an editor's suggested changes, but it's usually polite to explain why you've declined a particular change so that the editor at least understands where you're coming from. Most editors are going to be understanding. They don't want to publish something that you're going to dislike. But just bear in mind that if you and the editor can't come to an agreement around changes that you have declined, then there is a chance that they might decide not to publish your story after all, depending on what's in the contract. We should talk about copy edits too. So these are things like grammar fixes, typo fixes, very minor wording changes, and other things to bring your story in line with that market's house style. Copy edits are usually done fairly close to publication, and you'll usually receive either a marked up document with track changes, or you'll be sent a draft version of that piece for you to review. So for instance, if your piece is going to be published on a website, you might get a link to a web page that is going to look like your final published piece, but isn't live to the public yet. Copy edits usually aren't too controversial, but occasionally you might get an editor who oversteps their bounds or simply gets something wrong. A good editor shouldn't change the voice or the style of your piece just for the sake of it or to make it more like how they would write it. But if an editor hasn't undergone any kind of formal editing training, they might not understand this. If they're changing the writing style just to better suit their own personal taste, you can consider pushing back. And equally, if they have gotten something wrong grammatically, you can politely point this out to them, ideally also with a link to some kind of reference that backs you up. They should provide you with clear instructions about how to respond to them about edits. So for instance, they might want you to manually accept or decline the track changes in a Word document, or they might want you to write back and simply say whether you accept all of the suggested edits, or they might want you to review a PDF and come back to them with your feedback. Occasionally, with some short fiction markets, you won't be contacted about any edits before your story is published. And if that's the case, it should be because there was only very minor copy edits, if that, needed to your story, and they didn't consider the changes significant enough to contact you about. So that can be nice. Talking about working with short fiction editors more generally, I've usually had really good experiences working with editors. Their suggestions have made my stories stronger and clearer. There have only really been 2 times where I haven't had that great an experience working with an editor. One was where he changed the style of some of my piece to better match his own personal taste, which is not something that you really should do as an editor. He cut quite a few words that I didn't think were necessary to cut. And the second time was where an editor wanted a lot of content changes and rephrasings, some of which I thought actually hurt rather than helped the story. So that required a bit of back and forth and negotiation to arrive at something that we were both happy with in the end. So some final points. Please don't be too concerned about working with editors. Most of them are perfectly nice people and they just want your story to be the best that it can be. There are some occasional bad actors. Please make sure to carefully read the submission guidelines for that publication and also your contract to make sure that there isn't anything dodgy in there. And it can also be really helpful to be part of the short fiction community or to be talking to people who are also submitting and publishing in those magazines to get a sense of whether there is anything to be concerned about or whether everything is fine. And you really can push back on requested edits if you don't agree with them. They're not set in stone just because the editor has asked for that change. So that's it for today. If you've got any stories about particularly good or bad experiences working with editors, I'd certainly be keen to hear them. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said today, please let me know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.